Imagine for a moment a punishment so cruel, so disturbing, that it seems more like a horror movie plot than something that actually happened in the real world. It's a punishment so vile, it's difficult to wrap your head around it. And it happened in one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world, the Persian Empire. Today, we're going to talk about Scaphism, one of the most horrifying methods of execution ever devised by humans. It's a punishment so grotesque, you'll be shocked by its sheer cruelty. If you thought you've heard about bad punishments in history, you haven't heard anything yet. Stick around, because this is one history lesson that will haunt you long after you've heard it. Welcome back, history lovers. If you thought history was all about great empires, grand battles, and extraordinary kings and queens, then let me take you on a journey to the darkest part past. The side of history that we don't often talk about, the brutal, cruel punishments that were once used to deal with criminals, traitors, and even enemies of the state. One such punishment that has survived the test of time as a truly horrifying form of execution is called Scaphism. It's not one you hear about every day, but once you know about it, it will leave a lasting impact. In this video, we're diving into the terrifying details of Scaphism, one of the most grotesque and terrifying punishments ever carried out in ancient history. You may have heard about executions like the guillotine, hanging, or even crucifixion, but none of those come close to Scaphism. This is not just a death sentence. It's a slow, agonizing, and unimaginable form of suffering. Keep watching as we unravel the gruesome tale of Scaphism, a punishment that makes death look like a blessing. The origins of Scaphism. Before we dive into the horror of Scaphism itself, it's important to understand where it came from and why it was used. The origins of Scaphism can be traced back to the ancient Persian Empire, which was one of the largest and most powerful empires in history. At its peak, Persia ruled over vast territories stretching from modern-day Iran to parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia. But with great power came the need for control, and that's where Scaphism comes into the picture. Scaphism was a punishment used by the Persians for certain severe crimes, especially treason or desertion. The punishment was meant not just to execute the criminal, but to do so in the most agonizing, drawn-out, and public manner possible. The aim was to create terror and fear, to make sure that anyone thinking of betraying the empire would think twice. Imagine being so afraid of a punishment that the mere thought of it would make you reconsider committing any crime, no matter how small. The ancient Greek historian Plutarch is one of the main sources that tells us about Scaphism. He describes in his writing as one of the most horrific forms of execution ever devised. The punishment's name itself is derived from the Greek word scaph, meaning a small boat or hollow vessel, which gives us a clue as to how the punishment was carried out. But to understand the full extent of Scaphism, we need to explore its grisly details. The process of Scaphism. Now that we have a bit of background on Scaphism, let's go through the horrifying steps of how this punishment was carried out. Brace yourself, because what you're about to learn is not for the faint of heart. The victim would first be stripped naked and placed inside a hollowed-out log or a small boat-like structure. The log or boat was just big enough to fit the victim inside, trapping them in a small, confined space. There would be no escape, no way out. The victim would be completely immobilized, with their body fully exposed. They couldn't move or fight back. Then, the executioners would smear the victim's body with a mixture of honey and milk. This might sound strange at first, but it was no accident. The honey and milk would make the victim's skin sticky and attractive to insects. Flies, ants, and other pests would swarm over the victim's exposed skin, laying their eggs in the flesh. These insects would slowly begin to eat the person alive. It was an agonizing, slow process that would continue for days, sometimes weeks. The worst part? The victim was not knocked unconscious or given any form of relief. They were left fully aware of what was happening to them. Imagine the horror of knowing that bugs were crawling all over your body, biting into your flesh, laying eggs in your wounds, and feeding on your exposed skin. And the suffering didn't end there. The victim would also be forced to drink a mixture of honey and milk, which would cause severe diarrhea. This was part of the torment. The feces would collect in the hollowed-out log or boat, making the situation even worse. As the victim continued to defecate, they would be forced to sit in their own filth, attracting even more insects. The accumulation of waste and the swarming insects made it a true nightmare for the victim. The long, agonizing death One of the most terrifying aspects of Scaphism was how long it lasted. This was not a quick death. It was a long, drawn-out, and incredibly painful process. The victim's body would be consumed by insects, and they would slowly start to waste away. The heat of the sun would dehydrate them further, making them weak and vulnerable to infections. The victim would become more and more disoriented as dehydration set in, and the pain from the insect bites and festering wounds would be unbearable. They would suffer from severe pain, weakness, and the agony of being trapped in their own excrement while being eaten alive. And the worst part? They were conscious of every single moment of it. The execution could last anywhere from several days to over a week. Some victims, depending on their physical strength and severity of their wounds, might survive for longer than others. But ultimately, the inevitable end would come: death. It could result from blood loss, shock, severe infection, or even a combination of all of these. The slow decay of the victim's body, combined with the intense suffering, made Scaphism not only one of the cruelest forms of punishment, but one of the most psychologically torturous as well. Why Scaphism was used? You might be wondering why such a horrifying punishment was ever created in the first place. The answer lies in the desire for control. Ancient rulers used punishment as a way to control their populations. Scaphism wasn't just about killing the person. It was about making an example out of them. It was a public spectacle designed to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who might think about defying the empire. Scaphism was typically reserved for people who had committed serious crimes, like betraying a king or deserting their army during battle. But the purpose of Scaphism went far beyond punishing the individual. It was about creating a culture of fear. Imagine living in an empire where people knew that if they crossed the wrong person, they could be subjected to a death so horrific that death itself might seem like a mercy. Scaphism wasn't just a punishment. It was a warning. The public nature of the execution added another layer of terror. Victims would be left exposed, in full view of everyone, as their bodies slowly decayed. The entire town or city would witness the suffering, which acted as a deterrent for anyone considering a similar crime. The legacy of Scaphism. As time went on, Scaphism eventually faded into history. After the fall of the Persian Empire, this method of execution was no longer used. The cruelty of Scaphism became something too horrible to bear, even for those in power. But that doesn't mean it wasn't influential. The memory of such a disturbing punishment served as a grim reminder of how far people would go to maintain control, and how cruelty could be justified in the name of law and order. Scaphism is now a piece of forgotten history, something we look back on with horror and disbelief. But it's important to remember that it wasn't just one isolated instance of cruelty. Throughout history, other empires and rulers have used similar forms of punishment to assert their dominance and intimidate their subjects. In some ways, Scaphism serves as a reminder of the darkness in human nature. It shows us just how far some people will go when they hold power over others. It's a chilling chapter in history that, while it may be forgotten, still lingers as a warning of what happens when cruelty and absolute power collide. The ethics of Scaphism. Looking at Scaphism from a modern perspective, it's almost impossible to imagine anyone justifying such an inhumane punishment. It raises important ethical questions about the nature of punishment, justice, and human dignity. Can a punishment ever be justified if it involves causing this level of suffering? Was there ever a situation in which Scaphism could be seen as fair or necessary? The fact that such a punishment was not only used but accepted by ancient Persian society challenges our ideas about justice. We often think of punishment as a means of deterrence or correction, but Scaphism turns that notion on its head. It wasn't about rehabilitation or justice. It was about terrorizing the population into submission. And perhaps that's one of the most horrifying aspects of it, the sheer disregard for human dignity in favor of power and control. In today's world, Scaphism would be considered not just unethical, but unthinkable. And yet, throughout history, there have been many other examples of societies using brutal forms of punishment to maintain control. What does this tell us about the lengths to which human beings will go when they feel the need to assert dominance over others? The cultural and psychological impact of Scaphism. As horrifying as the process of Scaphism was, it's also important to consider the broader cultural and psychological impact that this punishment would have had on those living in the Persian Empire. People in the ancient world had a different relationship with death and punishment than we do today. Execution methods, particularly the more brutal ones, were not only acts of justice, but also public spectacles. They were meant to reinforce the power of the ruler and remind the public of the consequences of defying authority. When Scaphism was carried out, it wasn't just the victim who was affected. The entire population would have been exposed to the spectacle. Imagine being a citizen of the Persian Empire and knowing that such a fate awaited anyone who dared to cross the ruler. The psychological toll of living under such a system would have been immense. Even the most minor transgressions could lead to a punishment that was not just about death, but about the slow, painful destruction of the body and mind. Public executions were designed to be acts of terror, serving as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging the power of the state. In this context, Scaphism was the epitome of fear tactics. It wasn't just about inflicting pain on one person. It was about creating an atmosphere where the entire society felt the threat of such a fate hanging over them. Even if they weren't directly involved, just witnessing such a horrific execution would have left a lasting imprint on the collective psyche of the people. This type of punishment likely created an environment where fear was pervasive. People were not only afraid of what might happen to them if they broke the law, but also terrified of witnessing the unimaginable suffering that could befall someone else. This fear would have contributed to maintaining order in the empire, but it also would have deeply affected the moral fabric of society. The constant threat of Scaphism might have forced people to suppress their individuality and conform to societal expectations out of pure self-preservation. The psychological toll on those who witnessed such executions must have been profound. Think about how people in ancient times viewed the world. Death was a part of life, but the brutality of Scaphism pushed the boundaries of what could be considered an acceptable form of punishment. The mere idea of someone enduring such a slow and torturous death would likely have made people question the moral limits of justice and punishment. How much suffering could be justified in the name of law and order? Scaphism certainly blurred the lines. Comparisons to other ancient punishments. While Scaphism is one of the most infamous and disturbing punishments in history, it wasn't the only extreme form of execution used in the ancient world. The ancient world in general had a troublingly rich history of inhumane and creative methods of execution. Some of these punishments were equally brutal, though none quite matched the sheer psychological and physical horror of Scaphism. One of the most well-known forms of punishment was crucifixion, used notably by the Roman Empire. Crucifixion was designed to be a slow, painful, and public form of execution, intended to humiliate the person and discourage others from committing crimes. While crucifixion caused excruciating pain, it was a different kind of torture. The person was nailed to a cross and left to die, but it was typically a quicker death compared to the drawn-out, prolonged suffering caused by Scaphism. The pain was intense, but it was not compounded by the presence of insects or the filth of excrement. Another infamous punishment was the breaking wheel, used in medieval Europe. The victim would be tied to a large wheel, and their limbs would be shattered with heavy blows, causing immense pain and injury. The wheel itself was a symbol of the victim's suffering and humiliation. Again, while this punishment was brutal, it didn't involve the prolonged agony of being eaten alive by insects, which is what makes Scaphism stand out. There are other ancient punishments that involve torture or slow deaths, such as being flayed alive, boiling to death, or being stoned to death, which, like Scaphism, involve prolonged pain. However, Scaphism remains particularly memorable due to its combination of psychological torment, the victim's awareness and helplessness, and physical suffering, being eaten alive by insects covered in filth and slowly decaying. The uniqueness of Scaphism lies in the fact that it wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was about destroying the person both mentally and physically. The victim would be left with no hope of escape, no possibility of ending their suffering early, and no way to fight back against the insects and decay. This made Scaphism one of the most terrifyingly effective ways to instill fear in the population. The role of insects in Scaphism. When you think of Scaphism, you might immediately focus on the horror of the victim being trapped in a small boat or log. But an equally disturbing aspect of the punishment was the role that insects played in the victim's suffering. The victim wasn't just trapped in a wooden structure. They were trapped in a living nightmare, where bugs would feast on them for days. The insects in Scaphism were not just passive participants in the victim's death. They were active agents of pain. Flies, in particular, would swarm over the victim's body, laying eggs in the skin, and the resulting maggots would burrow into the flesh, feeding off the decaying tissue. It wasn't just about external wounds. The victim's body would slowly be eaten from the inside out, with the maggots feasting on their organs as well. Insects, while a natural part of the ecosystem, are often associated with decay and death. In the context of Scaphism, they became symbols of helplessness and torture. Imagine the horror of knowing that you were completely at the mercy of these tiny creatures, unable to escape or stop them from feasting on you. The victim would be powerless to stop the maggots from infesting their wounds, and this would make the suffering even worse. What makes this so disturbing is the fact that the victim was still alive and conscious throughout the process. Unlike other forms of punishment that might have resulted in unconsciousness before death, Scaphism ensured that the person would suffer the full, horrific experience. This made the insects involved in the punishment more than just an uncomfortable nuisance. They became instruments of terror and despair. The end of Scaphism. Despite the extreme nature of Scaphism, it didn't last forever. Over time, as the Persian Empire declined and eventually fell, this method of execution disappeared along with many other ancient practices. However, it's important to remember that although Scaphism itself is no longer in use, its legacy lives on in the stories we tell and in the lessons we draw from it. What Scaphism teaches us is the danger of unchecked power. It's a reminder that societies can sometimes become so focused on maintaining control that they lose sight of basic humanity. It's a lesson in the consequences of allowing cruelty to be justified in the name of justice. Even as empires rise and fall, the horrors of history have the power to teach us about the dangers of excess and the importance of compassion. Scaphism, the most disturbing punishment you probably never heard of, stands as a chilling testament to the extremes humanity is capable of when power goes unchecked. The victims who faced this punishment suffered not just physically but mentally, as their deaths were dragged out over days and weeks, leaving them helpless, tormented, and exposed to the cruelty of insects and excrement. This gruesome punishment was meant to send a message that defying the empire was not just a matter of life or death, but of absolute, unthinkable horror. While it may have disappeared with the fall of the Persian Empire, the memory of Scaphism lingers in the dark corners of history, reminding us of the depths to which cruelty can sink. If this video left you shocked and disturbed, make sure to hit that subscribe button to keep learning about history's darkest chapters. We'll be back with more stories that will both fascinate and horrify you. Let us know in the comments what you think about Scaphism, or if you've heard of any other ancient punishments that were equally shocking. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't always pretty, but it's always fascinating. See you next time